Hi folks, and welcome to our latest Peter Kirstein lecture, and thank goodness back in person, or at least in part. This is a hybrid event, and we've got a lot of attendees still online, but it really is nice to see people as well. I'd like to say a special welcome to Peter's family, so to Gwen, Claire and Lynn, and assorted grandchildren as well. And you are very welcome. I'm sure that Peter would have enjoyed what we're about to experience here. For those that don't know, Peter Kirstein founded the Department of Computer Science, of which I'm now head, and was in many ways a visionary and a really disruptive thinker. So did not accept conventional thinking, or actually even conventional ways of doing things necessarily, without question. And as a consequence, the department set its standout as being a department that challenged conventional thought. The Peter Kirstein lectures were intended to follow that thinking, right? So to challenge thought, not to be self-congratulatory, but actually an occasion where we can all learn something, where we can all think a bit more deeply about issues in the real world. We're very fortunate today to have Mikko Hyppönen giving the lecture, and we've gotten a distinguished panel as well to follow this, to think a bit more deeply about cybercrime. While Peter was alive, he and I discussed these lectures, and one of the things we decided at that point in time was that lectures should be organised by groups of people who are new to the department. So this embodies that refreshing, disruptive view of the world, so not self-congratulatory again. And I'm really pleased to thank, in advance, because I'm not going to talk anymore, our team. So we've got Lorenzo Cavallaro, Mirko Musalesi, and Madeleine Carr, ably supported, I must say, by Virgia Farouk, who's kept us on track and made sure it actually happened. And I'm going to hand over to Lorenzo now, and the rest of the team, for the remainder of this event. So thank you very much for coming. You're very welcome here. And I'm looking forward to this as much as I'm sure you are.
Thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. And welcome everyone to our annual Peter Kirstein lecture. So I have a confession to make. Not only was I extremely excited when I found out that Mikko has accepted our invitation, but that also triggered a very interesting, at times a little bit nostalgic trip down to memory lane, because I'm seeing that I'm sure that you might have seen some Mikko's talk that he waves a 5.25 inches floppy diskette. I guess that he has here the diskette as well today, but we'll find out in a second. That had the brain virus on it. And so the brain virus is the first computer virus for MS-DOS, allegedly, that spread around the world. And Mikko also went to visit the authors some years afterwards to find out where they are after. But that triggered some other memories around that period. The L cloner, which is another virus for Apple computers, the demo coder scene, the underground research communities that I'm very thankful for because I've learned many things from. All the way, I believe, to the true hacker philosophy of the 60s that spurred from MIT. Now, we've come a long way from that period that I consider nostalgically fantastic. And I guess that what was once started as intellectual curiosity and often a little bit for bragging rights as well, and now it's a menace to society. And I cannot think of any better person to tell us more about this than Mikko. Mikko's been working on cybersecurity and chasing, literally going physically to where the first virus was ever written, chasing cybercrime for the past 30 years. He's now with Secure and formerly F-Secure. And I cannot think of a better person than Mikko to help us understand nowadays cybercrime, what it is, how it evolved, what threats represents for our society, and what can we really do about it. So without any further ado, please welcome Mikko Hyppönen.
Thanks for coming. Thank you for the kind introduction. This is an honor for me. I'm really glad you invited me to speak to the Peter Kirstein lectures. Indeed, my name is Mikko. I am from Helsinki, and I have spent all my life trying to defend people's computer security and computer privacy. I'm not saying online security and online privacy, because I used to work with offline security as well, with computers before they were connected. And as indicated, I do always carry with me a 5 1/4 inch floppy just to remind myself of where I'm coming from. This is what I used to do for a living when I started analyzing viruses, reverse engineering malware, and hunting the early hackers. Around 5 years ago, I came up with this new term of cybercrime unicorn. And here, unicorn is a reference to unicorn companies. Typically high-tech, rapidly growing startup companies which become massively valued. Startup companies were making the headlines around 5 years ago, and I started wondering whether we would one day see cybercrime unicorns. What I mean by this is cybercrime gangs which are so wealthy and so powerful and control so large amounts of money that we should be considering the crime groups to be unicorns. And 5 years ago, this was sort of worth a chuckle. We weren't really sure if this is going to happen or not. Around the time, the wealthiest cybercrime gangs that we were tracking had something like $10 million or euros in their wealth. Unfortunately, in the last 5 years, this forecast has become true. Cybercrime unicorns are real, and they do exist today. We are now living the age of cybercrime unicorn. And I'll go through a little bit of the background, how this happened, what explains this, and what does it actually mean? Like, what kind of attacks are we now seeing when the enemy is more powerful than ever before? And indeed, all of this would have sounded like science fiction during the early years of my career, when viruses were spreading on floppy disks and viruses were written by hobbyists. In the 1990s, nobody was making any money by writing viruses or creating Trojans or running botnets or none of that. Viruses were being written by teenage boys for no reason. They gained nothing by writing viruses or creating other types of malicious software. They didn't become famous, they made no money. They might cause some destruction, maybe that's what they were looking for. Or maybe they were looking for recognition, because early on we regularly saw viruses which would play games with the user, or show messages to the infected users, or show political comments on the machines which became infected. These are some examples of animations shown on screen of infected computers. These are from early 1990s. All of these are MS-DOS-based early malware. All of them are also examples of malware I analyzed and reverse engineered when they were brand new. And if you're interested in the early stages of malware history and how viruses used to look like when they were more innocent, you can actually run all of these on your own computer safely and securely today, thanks to the wonders of emulation technology. Internet Archive is hosting an online museum called Malware Museum. I'm the curator for the museum. You can run early MS-DOS viruses inside an emulator inside your browser. You can do this from your phone even, and you can actually see what the early viruses looked like. Some of them play music, some of them play games. For example, Casino, right here, actually overwrites the boot sector of the infected machine. Then you can gamble and you can actually win your data back. If you win, you will lose no data. If you lose, you will lose your data. If you just reboot, you automatically lose because the virus actually overwrites the boot sector, making the machine unbootable, but keeps a copy of the boot sector in memory. And if you win, it writes it back to the boot sector. So if you're interested in that, Google for malware museum. But all of this changed in 2003 by a largely insignificant malware which isn't found from history books at all, but maybe it should. A simple early Windows virus called Fizzer. By 2003, most of the malware had migrated from MS-DOS to Windows world, some of it to Mac environment like OS X, which was the operating system on Apple Macs at the time. But most of them were just, playing games with the user or showing messages or destroying things. In August 2003, we find a piece of malware which would actually drop a proxy on the infected machines. And proxy allows you to reroute internet traffic. And we didn't know why this piece of malware was doing that. This was a bit unusual. Why would a piece of malware drop a proxy on a machine? So we had a discussion about it in the lab. We were guessing that maybe they will try hacking into other computers later by connecting through the infected machines to try to hide their tracks, sort of like an early Tor router or something like that. So we decided to test this, and we infected one of our test machines on purpose and put it online, and then we just waited for incoming connections. We waited what would happen. What would the master of this infection do with the infected computers? 3 days later, we started seeing connections connecting to port 25 of the infected machines. That's the email SMTP port. And it started rerouting thousands and thousands of emails through the infected machines. So we intercepted some of the traffic and looked into it, and it was Viagra ads. Spam email. And of course, spam was already problematic at the time, but all of the spammers sending ad emails were using their own servers at the time, which made it pretty easy for spam filters to just blacklist bad servers. So what started happening here is that spammers who were sending all of these emails started paying money to people who would infect home computers to reroute the emails through home computers. So instead of having one machine sending all the spam, you would have 10,000 machines sending spam. And it would be hard to blacklist all of these addresses because they were real, genuine home computers which needed to be able to send email anyway. And this started to make money. Now everything changed. Malware writers who were able to infect large amounts of computers and create botnets out of them could now sell access to these botnets to spammers, and they would get money in exchange. The rules of the game changed. In fact, big part of the early happy hackers, malware writers who were writing viruses just for the fun of it, disappeared. They stopped. They hated seeing these spammers coming into their area of expertise and start to use their hobby of writing viruses to send spam. Others embraced this new development, and we started seeing more and more various kinds of monetization connected to malware. Spam was the first, but then we started seeing things like credit card theft and keyloggers collecting key presses from infected computers when users were doing online banking or doing online shopping, typing in the credit card numbers, getting that intercepted, getting those sent away, and then being resold. Again, that makes a lot of money. That's pretty obvious. Things keep evolving. We start to see exploit kits, which would take over computers in huge amounts of quantities simply by visiting a website. We started seeing denial of service botnets being built, which were then monetized by using these botnets to attack online websites, typically online stores, and shut them down with overloading attacks, and then demand a payment of ransom to stop the attacks. Pretty much any mechanism you could imagine that could be converted into money was started being utilized by these online criminals. But the big shift was around 8 years ago, and that's the introduction of ransomware. Now, early on, ransomware was pretty simple. The idea of ransomware is actually really obvious. It has been around for quite a while. The idea is that you steal valuable information and then you sell the valuable information to the highest bidder. The real innovation here is that the attackers realized that in most cases the highest bidder is the original owner of the information. You steal the information and then you sell it back. You don't sell it to someone else, you sell it back to the original owner. They will pay you money to get their own files back or to prevent the files from being leaked publicly. Now this still required another innovation, and that's cryptocurrency. Early ransomware was so early that Bitcoin wasn't yet a thing. So they were trying to collect ransom payments using virtual credit cards or vouchers or things like that, which made their life really hard. It's really easy to track where the money goes if the transactions are not done with cryptocurrency. But then in 2013, we found a piece of ransomware called Crypto Wall and then Crypto Locker, which were the first ones to use Bitcoin for payments. Bitcoin was invented in 2010. It took a couple of years for it to become commonplace, but by 2013, criminals could already use it to collect the ransom payments, and that changed everything. And we've been keeping a map of malware families, of different ransomware families, and the map has become so big I can't even fit it on a single slide anymore. And there's been tons of innovation in this space as well. One of my favorite examples of innovation by the criminals in ransomware space is Popcorn. Popcorn Trojan targets home users. Many of the ransomware families we see today are targeting small and medium-sized companies or large enterprises. This one was targeting home users. The ransom it was expecting was roughly 500 euros or 600 euros, somewhere in that range. And the basic idea is that when a home user has his home computer locked, they lose their history, their photos, their holiday pictures or pictures of their children growing up. And if they don't have a backup, they might be willing to pay money to get their own files back. Now, Popcorn Trojan locks up your home computer, explains you the messaging. It's asking for 1 Bitcoin, but this is 5.5 years ago. This was around 500 euros at the time. And it's explaining to you that you have to pay 1 Bitcoin and you will get your files back, but if you don't have the money to pay, they will give you your files back for free if you infect 2 of your friends. And that's pretty clever. You have to hand it to them. That's thinking out of the box, isn't it? It's like combining ransomware Trojan with some kind of a chain letter. And this actually worked. We tested this. They give you a URL. You keep posting this URL to Twitter or elsewhere, and people click on it, they get infected. And if you infect enough people that 2 of your victims will pay the ransom, the system will unlock your files automatically for free. Clever, isn't it? Now, money started to be a great influencer into not just the operations of the online criminals, but also the lifestyles of the online criminals. So where does online crime come from? Where are the criminals living? Well, they do live everywhere. That's true. We do have online criminals, caught online criminals right here in the United Kingdom. We have them right in my home country of Finland. That's true. But the vast majority of them are coming from countries which are in one way or another developing countries. Countries where technical experts don't have the same kind of opportunities they would have, for example, here in London or in my home country of Finland. If you know how to program, if you understand network protocols, you can easily get a well-paying job with your skills here in the West. But if you have the same skills and you're living somewhere in Siberia or in the countryside of China or in the slums of Sao Paulo, Brazil, it's not the same story. And this is the reason why we see more online crime coming from countries like these. And then money itself is a big motivator. There's so many online criminals who like to flaunt their wealth, show around all the money they've made, that they're actually making it more likely new criminals or new people want to become online criminals, want to become like them. I'll show you an example. Here's a video clip showing a guy called Yevgeny Nikulin. Maybe some of you recognize the road. This is the ring road going around Moscow. That's Yevgeny's Audi R8 and Lamborghini Huracan. Another example, another Russian. This is Karim Baratov. Yevgeny, the previous guy, hacked all of you because he hacked LinkedIn. Most of you have a LinkedIn account, I'm guessing. This guy hacked Yahoo, which still has a surprisingly large amount of users, but it's not really a service we would use every day anymore. Nevertheless, he also had a nice collection of cars. Then next one, this is the Evil Corp gang based in Moscow. Once again, another Russian gang. Once again, Lamborghinis and Audi R8s. These seem to be the favorite cars of the online criminals living in those places. And this is Maxim Boyko, another Russian. He prefers Rolls Royces. And they say always that crime doesn't pay. Obviously, crime pays. It pays very well, as you can see from Mr. Ismail Mustafa, or known online as Hush Puppy. Most of these earlier criminals I showed to you were making their money with ransomware. Hush Puppy has been making his money with business email compromise and with money laundering related to business email compromise operations. In fact, if you look at the statistics from companies doing cyber insurance, you would see that business email compromise attacks are roughly as big as moneymaker as ransomware. And it does show when you look at the Instagram of Hush Puppy. Well, there's his Lambo, there's his McLaren, another Rolls, another Bentley, another Rolls, a private plane. Yes, crime does pay. But we reached some kind of a highlight last summer. Out of all these online crime gangs, one particular gang started to make bigger and bigger attacks. And the gang I'm referring to here is REvil, or R-Evil. A Russian gang specializing in ransomware operations, targeting the biggest fish out there, targeting one of the largest oil pipeline companies in the United States, the largest meat company in the world, and then a software company providing management software for the largest MSSPs in the world, that's managed security service providers. As an end result, we saw grocery stores stopped, hardware stores stopped, factories stopped. Internet is now part of the way our societies function. It's crucial, but it's still going to get more crucial as time goes by. When technology is good enough, when it's useful enough, we can't live without it. A good example of that is electricity. All modern societies require electricity and require electric grids to work. Everything we buy needs power. Either we plug it to the wall or we charge the battery on the thing. All the devices we use assume that there's power somehow. And this has only taken 150 years to happen. Electric grids started to become a thing 150 years ago, around 1870. So electricity is now mandatory in modern societies. Connectivity will soon be mandatory. But today, when the internet goes down, it's mostly just expensive and inconvenient, but we will survive it. Like when Colonial Pipeline went down or JPS went down, it was really expensive and bad, but it's not like US society would crumble. If there would be a 10-year blackout on the planet thanks to solar storm or something like that, all modern societies would crumble. But losing internet wouldn't yet stop our factories permanently. They wouldn't yet stop our trains from running. Planes would go into the air without internet today in 2022. But if we look at where we will be in 10 years or 20 years, then we're getting closer to a situation where connectivity will be as mandatory as electricity. This was so crucial that high-ups and politicians and people in charge started to pay attention. Responsible countries have to take action against ransomware gangs who operate from their soil, says President Biden. This is from last summer as well. Right after that, US State Department made a historic move and announced a $10 million reward for information leading to arrest of that gang, R-Evil. $10 million if you rat on your friends, maybe your gang members. You get immunity, everyone else goes to jail, you don't have to go to jail, and you get $10 million. They're trying to break these gangs from within. And they know this method works because it has worked before. It has worked against terrorist gangs. In fact, US State Department's Rewards for Justice program, which is this program offering these rewards, previously has been used to offer $10 million rewards for ISIS and Al-Qaeda leaders. So this is how seriously US government takes the ransomware problem, as seriously as terrorism. The rewards are the same size. And this started what I called unicorn hunting season. We started seeing more and more of the biggest, the richest, the wealthiest gangs getting taken down by law enforcement in international operations, getting rattied from within, having outsiders to burn these operations. Remember Hush Puppy? Well, he was arrested. He was arrested in United Arab Emirates. He had 3 homes, one in Monaco, one in Lagos, Nigeria, which is where he was from, and one in Emirates. This is from Palazzo in Dubai, where he was arrested and extradited to New Jersey, where he's still waiting sentencing. He's going to get something in the range of 10 to 15 years, but he hasn't been sentenced yet. So innocent until proven guilty, but he did it. Another example. Operations taking down Conti gang. You see, this is Ukrainian law enforcement. Entering a house with alleged Conti members with a skeleton key or a general key which opens every door. Did you see the key? Did you pay attention? This is the key. That's how you operate it. And then other ransomware operators getting caught. This is their money getting calculated. This is US dollars. I don't know if you recognize these. These are Hrvatis. That's the currency in Ukraine. And they also had some of their wealth in precious metal. I actually thought this was gold. It looks like gold. It looked like gold to me. Then one of our analysts in the lab educated me that that's actually silver. That's what silver looks like. So it's not gold, it's silver. It's still a lot of money. So we were in the hunting season. Things looked great. We were getting more arrests of the biggest and wealthiest gangs more than ever before in countries which used to not cooperate with law enforcement as much as we wanted them to, including Russia taking action against our evil members. Now, Russia doesn't extradite their criminals, but they did arrest them and put them on trial. Everything looked great until the 24th of February. Everything looked great until Russia invaded Ukraine 2 months ago. Now, this is the point where I changed my pocket square. Here we go. Stand with Ukraine, Slava Ukraini. Russia was holding all the winning cards in their cyber operations, information operations, and hybrid operations for a decade. They were using their troll factories and their capability of shaping the opinions of the West through our own social networks very effectively for a decade, sowing distrust among the people of Europe, among the people of North America, making us fight each other. They were really good at that. They were able to influence the outcomes of 2 elections. They were able to break apart Republicans and Democrats in USA further apart than ever before. And divided nations are weak nations. This is exactly what Russia wanted, and they were winning. They were holding the winning cards. And then on the 24th of February, President Putin took the winning cards and threw them into trash. That's exactly what he did. He took the winning cards and threw them into trash by invading Ukraine, immediately turning the whole West to support Ukraine and to sanction Russia with the hardest sanctions they've ever seen. I was doing a remote lecture a couple of weeks ago to Ukraine over Zoom, and I told the audience, Ukrainian people, about how this war will be over one day, and when it will be over, the West will be there. We all want to do business with Ukraine. We want to help them recover. We want them to rebuild. We're more than happy to cooperate, do everything to make sure Ukraine rises. Ukraine will rise, and Russia will not. That's what's going to happen. Russia will become a third world country. The biggest country on the planet will be a third world country. When the war started, it started online. On the evening of 23rd of February, we started seeing Russian Viper attacks targeting infrastructure in Ukraine. 12 hours later, on the 24th, missiles started hitting buildings in Ukraine. Real world in land, air, and sea started. One day later, one of the biggest ransomware gangs in the world, Conti, put an announcement on their website. They run their own website in the Tor Hidden Service. And they announced that they are going to be part of this war. They announced full support for Russian government. They will use all of their knowledge, all of their experience, all of their know-how, all of their tools to attack the West, to revenge these unjust sanctions and to defend their home country, motherland of Russia. They were not the only crime gang pledging allegiance to Russia. Another ransom gang, actually this is not a ransomware gang, this is a ransom, they hack sites or companies. They don't encrypt anything, they just steal data and then demand a payment. They did exactly the same thing. But then we also saw interesting developments. For example, the Lockbit gang, they first announced that they're going to do the same thing. They're going to support Russia. Then pretty much immediately they changed their mind and said that no, actually they're not part of this war in any shape or form. They don't want to support Russia. They don't want to support anyone. They want to be independent. They want to be neutral. And then they explained that they realized that when they run ransomware operations, quite often the ransomware operation ends up in a payment, and when the ransom payment comes through, it's typically, from their point of view, paid not by the company, but by an insurance company. An insurance agency pays the ransom on behalf of the affected organization. And if you've ever read through the fine print of an insurance agreement, they somewhere always mention that this agreement doesn't cover acts of God or acts of war. And they realize that if they are part of the war, insurances are not going to pay, and they like money. So they're not part of the war. Whatever it looks like, it's not part of the war, because they want insurance agencies to pay their insurances. Now, Conti is a big gang, maybe 200 members. They thought they had a consensus that they're going to support Russia, and they were wrong. One of the internal gang members was Ukrainian and disagreed with the rest of the gang and started burning the rest of the gang. This is from February 27th. The war is now 3 days in. There's a new account on Twitter called ContiLeaks, which starts posting information about the other gang members, including mugshots and names and phone numbers, which wasn't expected by the rest of the gang. You would think a gang like this would break apart from having a sizable amount, maybe 25 members of the gang burned publicly. And it didn't happen. Conti continued operations. The leaker leaked internal chats, tools, documentation. We learned a lot of things about this gang, including the fact that it does operate like a company. They have different organizational structures. They have their own IT department, own HR department. They have legal, just like anyone else. They have physical offices. We also believe that they have an office in Dubai, including the offices in Russia. They have working hours. They pay salaries twice a month. And their revenue last year was around $200 million. That's what their software looks like from inside. That's the gang members visualized based on the leaks. That's their money flow. The main wallet controlled by Conti. Over the last 5 years, 65,000 bitcoins have gone through it. Fast forward to the 2nd of this month, 2nd of April. The company gets hit in Germany. A company called Nordex gets hit by ransomware. They put out a press release, Nordex Group impacted by cybersecurity incident. It takes us a while to connect the pieces, but turns out this is Conti. How can a group continue operating after they've been burned? Easy. They can continue as much as they want because they're being protected by their own government. They are supporting their government is supporting them. Now, why would Russian government allow a gang like this to continue ransomware operations? Because they hit targets like Nordex. What does Nordex do? It makes windmills. It's the 2nd largest wind turbine company in Europe and one of the largest operators of windmill farms. Why is this important? Because this is Germany. This is German power consumption. They're trying to get rid of reliance on Russian oil, gas, and coal and replace it with renewables. This is the best possible target from the point of view of the Russian government to hit with cyber attacks. Not only that, but they're also assuming that the victims pay the ransom. The ransom is paid in with unsanctionable currency, Bitcoin. You can't sanction Bitcoin. You can't regulate Bitcoin. Why can't you sanction Bitcoin? Why can't you regulate Bitcoin? Easy. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are based on math. Real world currencies like pounds and euros are based on nothing. Math doesn't care about your regulations. It doesn't care about your sanctions. It's sort of like we would pass a law which would say that the value of p or pi would be 4.14 instead of 3.14. Math would ignore the legislation. It would still be 3.14. Same thing here. You can't control it. And this is why these kind of attacks at hitting targets like Nordex, as then later announced on Conti themselves on their own website, makes so much sense. And this brings us to the last piece of the puzzle, which makes unicorns real. I mentioned that 5 years ago we were aware of several gangs which were controlling $10 million or 10 million euros of wealth. True. If you had 10 million in Bitcoin 5 years ago, in the last 5 years the value of one Bitcoin has increased 100-fold. Your 10 million has become 1 billion, and you have just become a unicorn. And that's where they like to keep their money. They don't keep their wealth in euros or pounds or dollars or yuans or hrvatis. No, they keep it in Bitcoin or Monero or Zcash. And especially the growth of valuation of Bitcoin explains a big part of this. So what do organized crime gangs do once they can afford to invest? Well, they invest into skills, which makes a lot of sense. That's a good move. So 2 years ago, we saw this website. This is a competitor of ours, a company called Bastion Secure. Does pen testing, penetration testing. You can hire this company to review the security of your organization's or your company's network. They will scan your network remotely for open ports, look for unpatched or vulnerable machines, break into your network, do lateral movement, then they will write a report about the weak parts in your system so you can fix them. This company hires pen testers all over the world for remote, fully remote, 100% remote positions, and they pay roughly double the salaries normal companies pay. And this company doesn't exist. It's not real. It's a front for a gang called Fin7, known also as Karbanak, operating from Russia. And when pen testers join them, then they are explained that, okay, today's task is to do a pen test report for this company. Break in, write a report, just like you would. And then the higher-ups pick up the report, thank you very much. And the company has never ordered a pen test. And of course, then they will use the report to break in for real and deploy ransomware for real. They can compete for skill with cash because they can afford to invest because they are unicorns. Which then takes us to the next step, which hasn't happened yet. But it's obvious it will happen next. And that's AI/ML, artificial intelligence and machine learning. The highest barrier for entry for doing any of top-scale AI ML things is finding the people. There's a massive shortage of artificial intelligence programmers or analysts or professionals. Right now, if you know anything about programming TensorFlow systems or running machine learning frameworks, you can get a really nice, really well-paying job anywhere on the planet. There's no reason for you to break any laws. Like, why would you break the laws if you don't have to? But then again, if someone offers you triple the salary or 10 times the salary you would get elsewhere, then maybe it's tempting. And now these criminals are getting there. We haven't yet seen malware fueled by AI, but we will. We will see things like malware which automatically rewrites its own code to escape detection, or spam campaigns or phishing campaigns which learn what works and what doesn't and adjust automatically. And the only thing which can stop a bad AI is a good AI. And we are right about to enter an arms race in this space as well. So let me play you one more video about artificial intelligence. Будет владельцем мира, will become the leader of the world. Whoever rules artificial intelligence will become the ruler of the world. Don't take it from me, take it from Mr. Putin. Thank you very much.
So, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. We'll try to come to you as quickly as possible. There's another mic here that should be working. Yes, there's a question over there. Vijaya? Sorry. It's over there. Yep.
Hello? Hi. So with a lot of organized crime organizations, when they start getting very big, there's a lot of competition, they start to infight. They fight over territory. They fight over resources and money. Have you noticed that with a lot of these big cybercrime organizations and companies that there is a lot of fighting between them? They start to burn each other. They start to take each other down, attack each other. Or is it sort of situations like this Russian invasion of Ukraine that once they start taking political sides that they start fighting between each other?
Great question. We've seen both. These gangs organize themselves by languages. There's big, obviously Russian-speaking cybercrime gangs, but then again, for example, Vietnam has an active cybercrime scene, and they have their own chats, own discussion boards, own forums where they do business. And of course, then we have international discussions. Typically, then the joint language is English. And they do fight for territory. That does happen. And they do burn each other. We've seen like doxing. That's the term we use for what I showed to you briefly was doxing of 3 online criminals that's showing their real world identities to everyone, including law enforcement. And that has happened between cybercrime gangs as well. It's rare. It's more common that these gangs cooperate. They share intelligence. These jobs are quite often outsourced. So a gang is rarely as organized as Conte is, where they actually have offices and all that. Typically, it's a virtual operation. And if one gang member doesn't deliver, for example, a coder or a sysadmin doesn't do what it's supposed to, then they just find another one. Very virtual, very easily reorganized organizations. So there's probably more cooperation than in fighting. And then we have the real-world crime gangs. One thing that we've been tracking for quite a while is that what kind of links do this new type of organized crime have with the old kind of organized crime? Old kind of organized crime, traditional real-world crime groups, mafias, triads, yakuzas, these kinds of gangs. And there's surprisingly little overlap. There is some, typically involving money laundering, but that's pretty much the only thing we see, which is a bit surprising. You would think that traditional real-world crime gangs would expand into online world, and they really haven't done that, except in money movements. And drug trade, of course, happens in online world, but all the other kinds of traditional real-world online crime group activity still happens in the real world.
Thank you. Great talk. You mentioned Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies a few times as one of the key aspects of modern cybercrime. What can we do there to disrupt it and make there, as we can't break Bitcoin by itself, can't break the mass? What can we do? Is it money laundering based? Is there other policies that we can do?
Yes. So we can't regulate math. We can't regulate what happens inside blockchain. That's all outside of regulation. What we can and should regulate is exchanges. When you move real-world currencies into virtual currencies or vice versa, or if you use virtual currencies to buy real-world things like the Lamborghinis, that we can and that we should be regulating. And it's the only place which we can regulate. And today that takes us pretty far. But it's clear we are going towards a future where a bigger and bigger part of the things we want to purchase never leave the online world and can happen fully in blockchain environments. So it's getting harder and harder to do that. But right now the key point to regulate is the transactions between real-world currencies and virtual currencies.
We have another question over there, and I'm coming to you. And then we'll pick something from Slido.
Thanks, really wonderful talk. So I was just picking up a little bit on your links with sort of, for example, governments and cybercrime. You mentioned a little bit about the Russian government. Is there anything else going on at the sort of government level? And are you seeing increasingly sort of governments sort of supporting these kinds of things? I mean, from our sort of very public-private sort of perspective, it seems like governments have a lot of tricks up their sleeve in terms of backdoors into various infrastructures. And is that something that you're seeing more of, or would you like to just comment on that, please?
There's tons of governmental capabilities for offensive cyber action, which is done by the governments themselves. Today, I spoke about the cybercrime unicorns, civilians, cybercrime gangs, and the links they have with governments, which do exist. There's other kinds of links as well between cybercrime gangs like these. For example, throughout the years, we've seen multiple cases where law enforcement, typically in Russia, has apprehended local criminals, and then in unclear circumstances, the criminals have walked free. And after that, they haven't had control of their botnet anymore. So it seems to be, and we don't have confirmation of this, but what seems to happen is that if you control a big botnet and you get caught with the Russian law enforcement, they give you an offer you can't refuse. Give your botnet to us and you can walk away. And of course, a botnet with, let's say, 100,000 infected computers around the world is very valuable for intelligence agencies. Now they can mine, we want information from this country. How many computers do we have in that country? Where in that country are the computers? In which companies? In which ministries? In which defense contractors? Highly useful ways of gaining access to places. And they already have a great cover story on how they have access. I mean, this is a banking Trojan which just happens to hit your network. So even if they are caught, the victims, who of course are paranoid about getting hit by a foreign government, will just look at it and realize that this is a banking Trojan from 2 years ago. We thought it's a governmental attack, and it's just some run-of-the-mill malware. So it's a great cover story for governments as well. Then it's a totally different discussion on what kind of capabilities governments have themselves. So for example, in the current war in Ukraine, we have the 3 main intelligence agencies from Russia waging war in cyberspace by themselves, not using help of civilians or cybercrime gangs, but directly from government officials. Today, all capable countries build both defense and offense in cyberspace. All militaries have capabilities of attacking in cyberspace. And it makes a lot of sense because cyber weapons are effective, they're affordable, and they're deniable. And that's a pretty good weapon. When it gets the job done, it's cheaper than the real world equivalent, and you can deny it's not your weapon. And it's the reason why we are, from my point of view, in a completely new arms race. We're right now in a new arms race which we've never seen before, and it is the cyber arms race.
So I thought that an interesting question that we have on Slido is around any thoughts on NFTs and crime. And I picked this question specifically because NFTs has been quite controversial.
Sure.
And what are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Non-fungible tokens. There's plenty of money laundering being done through non-fungible tokens. In many ways, you could liken the buying and selling of non-fungible tokens to buying and selling of fine art or any other real-world collectibles. And there's tons of money laundering happening with that. It's even easier done with NFTs because there's nothing physical happening. The payments are done with cryptocurrencies, and they're all anonymous to begin with. So it's no wonder a big part of that. And I think that's the main link to online crime. Interestingly, during the Ukrainian war, we've seen the Ukrainian governmental cyber police gather donations for their operations by selling NFTs. I've never seen a government, much less cyber police, selling NFTs to fund their operations, but they're doing that right now, which is remarkable. Another interesting thing is that they're accepting donations to support their operations to fight Russian cyber aggression in cryptocurrency donations, including Monero donations. And Monero, together with Zcash, is the most anonymous cryptocurrency we have, much more anonymous than Bitcoin. In fact, over my career, I've never seen Monero used for anything else except crime. Except now, cyber police in Ukraine is accepting donations in Monero. So there's a legit need for Monero. And I'd actually like to make a more wider comment on ethics of technology here. When we speak about cryptocurrencies or encryption algorithms or Tor hidden service, we quite often end up into a discussion about, are these technologies good or bad? And a very common way of not really answering the question is to answer the question that, they are just tools. They can be used for good and they can be used for bad, which is true. All of these technologies, you can use them for good and you can use them for bad. It's true. But I think it's actually a lazy way of avoiding answering the real question. Because in my opinion, some of these technologies certainly can be used for both, but they are in practice used much, much more for one or the other. So for example, encryption technologies, sure, can be used for bad. Bad people use encryption, terrorists use encryption, that's true. But the vast, vast majority of encryption is good. Every time you use the web, the HTTP connection is encrypted, which makes your things more private and safer. Okay, what about Bitcoin? What about cryptocurrencies? What about Tor hidden service? Well, in my book, most of that is bad. I mentioned Monero. I've only really seen it used by criminals. This is the first case I've seen it used for anything else. Sure, Bitcoin absolutely can be used for good, and lots of people use it for good. But then again, tons of the use is avoiding taxes or doing something like that. And then Tor hidden service, initially created as a way of avoiding censorship, originally funded partly by US Air Force. Now that it can be used to host websites in the Tor hidden service, in my book, it's used much more for bad than good. And I do know there are people living in totalitarian countries using Tor hidden service to access Wikipedia, which is good. Absolutely, it happens. And there are minorities which have no other place to discuss what they want to discuss except Tor hidden service forums. But there's so much crime, and the worst kinds of crime we could imagine, and that's all being done over there. Technologies are not innocent. Sure, they can be used for good and bad, but we should be realistic about how big part of them is being used and how big part of them is being used for bad.
Thanks. So I wanted to pick up on another question on Slido, because I believe it's fairly interesting to also get in towards the end of the Q&A session. I do have also a question myself, so I'll keep it for the last because I'm holding the mic. But this one is also an interesting question because it opens up a little bit of positive perspective on this. So what can we do in a sense? So the question reads, great talk, Mikko. What are the useful skills we can pick up to enter the field of cybersecurity for the next decade? And the question says, pen testing, network architecture design, et cetera, et cetera. And if I can add on this, because these are skills that there's been a shortage, we still are in need. But I guess here, as you mentioned also that the landscape, the ecosystem is changing. Are these skills still valid, or do we need to revise them? And in what way? Or this might be just, a sort of a foundation that we cannot just omit them, but we need to have something more.
Well, to become an expert in this field, first of all, it's a good idea to become an expert in this field. There's job security in security. Take it from me. There's no shortage of things. We are not going to run out of bad people anytime soon, which means there's going to be jobs for us defending against these things. And it's also a job which feels like it makes a difference, feels like it's important. Like when I walk around our offices, we have 1,700 people working for us, and I'm looking at the people with world-class skills who could be working anywhere, doing anything. They could be, building operating systems if they wanted to, or games, or networking gear, or search engines. They could build anything, but they choose to work in security. They choose to use their skills, their energy, to help others. Because that's what you're doing when you're building security. You build expertise so you can help other people. And I'm not saying that it's not a job. It's a job. You get paid to do it. But it's a bit more than just a job. And that's what has kept me in this industry for over 30 years. You go home at the end of the day feeling good about what you have done. And I'm not saying like building games or building operating systems. I'm sure it's great. I'm saying it's still a little bit different to building security. And the career advice, I'm not sure if I'm the right guy to give ideas on that. A general idea, which I think always works, is that pick a niche, a narrow area of expertise that you're interested in, that you like, and then run with that. Become the best in the world in that. No matter how narrow the pitch or the niche area is, there's always going to be someone who needs expertise in that area. And if you're one of the best in that area, you will always have a well-paying job for yourself. So pick what you're interested in and then just focus on that. Now, of course, that will require general understanding of basics of technology and computer science and most likely programming. But then once you have the groundwork laid, pick a narrow field of expertise and run with it.
Thank you.
That's my answer.
Thank you. And I guess, to wrap it up, I just wanted to ask you something that you used to finish up your presentation. And it's a little bit of a biased question. I'm a systems security researcher, and I work in particular at the intersection of AI and cybersecurity. And there's been a surge of interesting challenges from the academic landscape on this. Not just to mention things that you inherit from applying machine learning the proper way on cybersecurity, all the issues that we have with data set shift and so forth and so on, but also something that's peculiar to security because you need to deal with the adversaries that are actually trying to bypass and manipulate the system, right? So where do you see, and I'm trying to find out kind of a narrowing direction to bring academia and industry a little bit closer to prioritize all the problems that there are in the field. So what do you believe is going to be the first problem that we can observe in the field of AI and cybersecurity?
The great news about AI and cybersecurity is that good guys have been using AI and ML already for ages. Like we started our first ML programs 17 years ago. So good guys have been doing this for years and years. Bad guys are about to start only now, after such a long time, which is surprising, but like I explained, there's clear reasons for that. Now, we can go into different directions with this. Someone would certainly highlight things like deep fake voices and faking identities, and then use that in cyber attacks, for example, CEO scams and things like that. Some would claim it has already happened, and I would like to see the evidence, not just stories of it happening. But I would aim actually to much more practical level. Everything I showed about cybercrime gangs, right now that is all being run manually. So a group like Conti, they're releasing a new version of their ransomware. They're starting what they call a campaign. They decide how are they going to reach their victims. Typical choice would be email. So let's send out emails. They have an email list of millions of email addresses. Let's craft different kinds of emails. Let's start spamming out. The emails will contain a link. Link will take them to a website which contains an exploit which will take over their computer and drop a Windows exe binary on their hard drive. They start running the campaign. They start spamming out the emails, and they will start immediately seeing that some of the emails don't go through. They're getting blocked by filters and gateways looking for suspicious traffic and spam filters. So they adjust the emails. They modify, they rewrite them. Let's try again. All right, the next step. Do the people actually receive the email and read it? Are they getting blocked by some kind of filter at the desktop level? Bypass that manually. Then are the users clicking on the link? Does the link work, or is it getting blocked by, again, reputation systems for bad URLs? If so, let's register new websites. Let's change the addresses manually. And then the actual binary. Is it getting blocked by endpoint protection, by antivirus, by heuristic detection? If so, let's recompile the binary manually. This is slow. And all of this could be easily replaced with a simple machine learning system, a simple script which would just learn and adjust accordingly, rewrite the code, recompile, change the website, register new sites. And when that happens, then all of the operations that the attackers are doing would be 100-fold faster. We can tell it's done manually because it's so slow. It takes them time to react, to adjust, to register, to recode. All of that would have been done in an instant if it would be done by automation. Now remember, the response, the defenders are using automation. So I've described this as a game of ping pong. Ping pong, where the pongs, the replies come back immediately. Ping pong. Ping pong. When they change the automation or start to use automation at their end as well, then it is going to change into a game of ping pong, ping pong, ping pong, ping pong. And it will skyrocket in speed. And we will not miss when that happens. And it hasn't happened yet. And this is going to be, I guess, the first step that they will be doing.
Thank you. So I just wish to thank Mikko for a great talk and a very engaging Q&A session. Apologize for people online. There are other questions on Slido, but for the sake of time, we cannot pick them up. And I wanted to hand it over to Professor Madeleine Carr, Professor of Global Politics and Cybersecurity at UCL Computer Science, who's going to introduce the panel. So don't go anywhere. So the show is not over yet. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Lorenzo, Steve, and especially Mikko for such an incredible and slightly alarming presentation.
Sorry.
As Lorenzo said, my name is Madeleine Carr. I'm a professor of global politics and cybersecurity here in the Department of Computer Science at UCL, and it was a real honor and a pleasure to work with the rest of the team and Steve Hales on pulling this day together. I did want to just take a moment to acknowledge the contribution of Peter Kirstein to the Department of Computer Science, to UCL, and to really the digital revolution, because the role he played was just so significant on all those levels. And I actually had the real pleasure of getting to know him in the last years of his life, and his depth of knowledge and his expertise was just so significant. But he was also just genuinely such a lovely, charming, generous, kind person that it's clear why he's left his mark on the world in the way that he has. So for this panel, following Mikko's presentation, what we wanted to do was in the spirit of what Steve pointed out, this kind of effort to challenge our orthodox thinking and to really push the boundaries of how we see what we do in this discipline, or in this, I guess we wouldn't even regard ourselves as a discipline. We're such a mixed bag of people now who work in cybersecurity. How we could think about, critically think about what our role is in society, and kind of pushing ourselves forward. We wanted to bring together a panel to help us do that and to help us think about that today. We're just so delighted to have the people here. This was our real wish list when we sat down to think about who would be great to help us take this forward. These were the people. So I just want to briefly introduce them, and then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to reflect a little bit on Mikko's presentation, and we'll take it from there. So obviously we've already met Mikko. Wanted to introduce Gordon Carrera, who's been covering security issues, broadly speaking, for the BBC for, I think, 18 years. It's a long time. A long time. And really, Gordon's analysis of the issues that we look at in cybersecurity more generally is kind of always on everyone's reading list. For that amount of time to have been covering security issues and to be holding governments and business to account and ensuring that civil society has a really digestible understanding of what these issues are and what they mean for us is just so important. And I think anyone who works in this field has always read your work, Gordon, with real interest. And I think one of the key things that Gordon will bring to this panel is this understanding of where cybercrime and cybersecurity sits now in this broader context, this geopolitical context of, how does this fit into the broader security issues that we see now? How does it intersect with the kind of geopolitical issues that it's taking place with in right now? And then Craig Jones, the director of cybercrime for Interpol, based in Singapore. So just so delighted to have the opportunity to have Craig here. He's got nearly 3 decades of experience in law enforcement, from, again, a wide range of dimensions, but really focusing so much on the digital aspect, on communications and on cybercrime latterly. He's worked for the NCA. He's worked as a policeman. And he's got a tremendous knowledge of what international cybercrime is and what kind of efforts are necessary to try and deal with that. Interpol works with 195 countries, so basically the whole world, on trying to coordinate these responses to cybercrime. So just a tremendous amount of knowledge in Craig's head, which is going to shape the conversation today. And then Professor Gloria Laycock, just a kind of icon at UCL. Gloria did a psychology degree here at UCL in the 60s and has really dedicated her professional life to understanding crime, criminology, and criminals. Really from a psychological perspective. She was the inaugural director of the Jill Dando Institute of Crime Science, which is a very important aspect of UCL's work on cybercrime. And she also did some very admirable work, and something that we kind of try very hard to do now, but Gloria did, I guess, kind of naturally, in that she established a research group within the Home Office to really pull through those research findings and help them to be implemented and applied in a real setting. So kind of impact work way back before we really thought about impact, I guess. So Gloria's got this great depth of knowledge about the psychology of criminals and the psychology of criminal gangs, and I think that's going to be really interesting for us today to think about what the motivations of these people are, and it was just so interesting to hear from someone who's worked in crime science for such a long time. What does this moment mean to Gloria's work? So I have a long list of questions, but I'll try and inject them when I get an opportunity. I'd like to hand over now, Gordon, to you to kind of reflect on Mikko's talk, and let's take it from there.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you especially to Mikko. It is always a privilege to hear him talk. I always find it fascinating to hear that historical perspective. It's also a privilege to be here at UCL in the Department of Computer Science. I'm slightly humbled. The last time I wrote my own computer code, I confess, was using the programming language BASIC in the 1980s on a Commodore VIC-20. So that really dates me. If anyone wants to know my programming skills, they're not so high. So I come to it with a slightly different perspective of covering national security, which I've been doing for many years. It's been pointed out. And I think one of the things I wanted to just briefly reflect on from Mikko's talk was some of the collapsing boundaries around cyber, which I think is an interesting theme. And I've certainly seen it in my work, because covering national security for a while, and cybersecurity maybe 10, 12 years ago started to appear in the national security space, perhaps around 2010. I don't know if people remember, there was a big attack on Google linked to China, Aurora, which was one of the first ones which really kind of caught attention. But still, cybersecurity was something over here, and national security was over here. And what we've seen really is cybersecurity move into the heart of national security. And in some ways, the boundaries between cybersecurity and national security disappear. And I think we've seen that in other disciplines as well. As Mikko was talking about primarily crime, you've seen cybercrime really is now crime. And sometimes it's cyber-enabled crime, sometimes it's straight online crime. But increasingly, the digital and the real world are merging. And the ability to say, well, that's cyber and that's not, is changing. And two reflections on that from what Mikko was saying. One was about, I think, Ukraine. And a lot of us who watch cybersecurity closely, that a lot of people were waiting for what they thought was going to be a kind of cyber Pearl Harbor. And, that phrase which you heard a few years ago. And were the lights suddenly going to go out in Ukraine overnight? And actually it didn't happen like that. And then some people were almost disappointed, really, it felt like, because they were expecting this big moment at last where the kind of full panoply of cyber warfare was unleashed. And it didn't quite happen like that. And instead, I think we have seen not cyber Pearl Harbor, but cyber trench warfare, which has been going on. But one of the reasons why I think it's been interesting is it is actually that cyber has been integrated into the kind of military operations by Russia. It's not been something separate, but they've looked at it and they've thought, well, what cyber, we're primarily using military weapons, traditional hard power, but where can cyber support that? Well, maybe taking down Ukrainian satellite communications. But often if you're in a full-scale warfare, do you want to blow up a power grid? Well, not if you're going to be taking over the country, you think, soon. Also, if you want to do it, maybe you'll use a missile rather than cyber warfare. So you can see that actually the evolution to integrating cyber with other forms of power and capability, I think, in Ukraine in an interesting way that we've seen in the last few weeks. But also, I thought the other reflection I had from Mikko's talk was the overlap between cybercrime and straight national security, which you can see. And our evil and colonial pipeline was a really interesting example of that, I thought. The fact that this was fundamentally a criminal attack, but actually became a national security issue, in which you had the President of the United States, as we saw, appearing and saying, this is top of our national security agenda. We are holding the state which harbors these people to account potentially for not cracking down on it, escalating it in that way. And I think in some of the kind of aftermath of Ukraine as well, we've seen that the questions about the overlap between criminal groups and nation states. And I think some of the boundaries we used to see between those, perhaps we do need to rethink. And you can see it in North Korea, where you've got hacking groups which are actually doing crime, but to fundraise for the state. So, the kind of boundaries between criminality, nation state activity, cyber, online, offline, I think are increasingly blurring. So I suppose my slight challenge is, how long do we keep talking about cyber within a small context, and how far do we have to kind of keep bringing it into some of these broader contexts, whether it's crime or national security or military power, and thinking about it in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gordon. I wanted to ask you about your views on the Ukraine situation exactly. So that was really, really helpful. Craig, would you like to give us your thoughts on Mikko's presentation?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mikko. Great presentation. I identified with quite a lot of what we've been spoken about. I think if I do it from a policing model, what's the policing model that we now operate in? 1990 in April, I walked out of Tottenham Police Station with a hat on and patrolled the streets of Tottenham. I went out and I spoke to the communities. The crime was committed locally, the victim was locally, the prevention, protection work that we did was done locally, and the offenders were prosecuted locally. That was the model we had. And we saw development of serious and organised crime. So with the boundaries expanding, opportunities arose. And we looked at the business models now that criminals are using. So the opportunities within that sort of, we call fifth domain, the cyberspace, is now affording criminality fantastic opportunities from a business perspective. So if we look at it as a business model, which was explained really, really well there, is the criminals are very agile in this space, and the trust models that they operate in. So much in the same way as you used to have your local criminal groups that would start maybe with stealing a bike or something, and then you might move through that sort of criminal infrastructure and hierarchy into where, as in the local area, you're the main drug dealer and doing work in that space. This is now mirrored in the online space, but it's bigger, it's wider. The volume, the impact that we're seeing now is far greater than we've seen previously. So policing has to try and change that model that we operate in as well. And we could talk about, he takes pride in his work because he's protecting people. Well, the role of a police officer or police constable is the protection of life and property and the prevention of crime. So I describe myself walking out with a hat on. The image of a police officer is someone that patrols the streets with a hat on. So that policing concept, who's providing that protection to the communities, is not necessarily that frontline officer anymore. So when we look at how we're trying to police now, and certainly the privilege I have being at Interpol, the director of cybercrime, I get to travel the world. I used to, but we're starting again now. But I get to see a lot of different policing models effectively. And what we're trying to do with the policing model here now is create a global policing model for 195 countries. And that global policing model is looking to deliver policing in the community locally. So in order to do that, we have to understand what we're trying to do. So we're trying to prevent crime, we're trying to detect crime, we're trying to investigate crime, and we're trying to disrupt. So under those four pillars within the cybercrime area, where can we do the best work effectively? So the first one I'd say is prevention. So that's working with the industry. It's building in that security to our systems. Now, we're very good at going online, and we're very good at, we want to get on very quickly. I don't want to bother two-factor authentication. I might use a VPN, I've turned it off and everything like that. But we make ourselves vulnerable when we go online. But do we know how vulnerable we are? It's not like walking down a dark street in the night, and you wouldn't go there for that reason. But in the online space, we suddenly seem to change the way we operate and the information that we're willing to give up effectively. So there's a society piece to this as well about our understanding. I'm going to miss the detection, I'm going to miss the investigation, I'm just going to concentrate on the disruption. The groups that we target do this because they want to make money. So that's one of the ways that we'll go after and target them, is the money side of this. But we have to do that on a global scale. So the agility of law enforcement and bring that together globally is quite challenging, as you can imagine. 195 different countries, 195 different sets of legislation. How do we coordinate that activity? And again, that's one of the roles of Interpol, being a neutral organisation as well. So under Article 3, I can only deal with crime matters, as can all of our staff. So if it's political, military, religious or racial, we can't do that. So when we talk about the war in Ukraine, straight away, as soon as you go into that warfare space, it's political, it's military. We're not able to operate in that space. But we are, because we're able to identify the vulnerabilities to start with. So we look at the cyber threats, the vulnerabilities, and that comes back to that policing mandate. So prevention in the first instance is really, really key to our work. I think I'll leave it there because I know we're going to get plenty more discussion.
Yeah, we're going to have more time, definitely. I think that comment about the society piece is really important, and it's actually something that gets left off a lot with cybersecurity or cybercrime, because in fact, as you say, we're not always aware that we're that there's a crime being enacted against us, really. And then also, there's so little in cybersecurity practice or research that's actually aimed at civil society, at an individual. What do we do? How do we look after ourselves? I mean, apart from cyber hygiene and those kind of programs, which I don't think anyone has all that much faith in. Sorry, but I'm sure they do. But you know.
Sweeping statement.
Yeah. But then also the point about prevention, which really links, Gloria, into your work and the work that you've done on trying to design out crime and also your knowledge of kind of psychology of criminals and crime groups. So be really interested to hear from you on that.
Thank you. Well, that was scary, wasn't it? That whole presentation. I'm terrified. I'm going to go home and turn off my home hub.
Good idea.
A few things struck me in the talk, which was fascinating. The first one was the phrase the arms race. We've been fighting an arms race on the regular crime for decades, and I'm going to stick my neck out and say that we've won it. I mean, loads of criminologists would argue with me, but I like sticking my neck out, and they're wrong. When I say we've won it, we won it by realizing that prevention was primary. We have to prevent it and not try to detect it all the time. And on burglary, car crime, and theft, the volume crimes, they've crashed over the last 30 years. Car crime has reduced by over 80%. Domestic burglary has reduced by over 70%. Theft has reduced commensurately. And that happened because we got good data, we analysed it, and we learned that there are 5 ways to prevent crime. Increase the effort, make it more difficult to do. Increase the risk to the offender. Reduce the rewards. Remove the excuses, and reduce provocation. Now, removing excuses and reducing provocation aren't relevant for cybercrime. I haven't got time to go into the lecture for why not. But I want to replace those two with the word trust, because knocking the trust those gangs have in each other is another vulnerability that can be exploited. So increase the effort, increase the risk, reduce the rewards, and knock on the trust. Now, another area to look at is the difference between what you might call regular criminals and cyber criminals. And there are some interesting differences. I mean, Mikko mentioned there doesn't seem to be much of an overlap between those two sets of criminals. My impression is that there's far less infighting between cyber criminals. You did mention a little of it, but regular criminals fight for turf. They don't, on the whole, collaborate. Even in organised crime, less collaboration. I think cyber criminals probably have longer criminal careers. Most criminal careers end in the early 20s. Cyber criminals have got longer careers. I have no evidence, but they seem to be a bit cleverer to me. You know, the average thug on the streets is not going to go home and start hacking into British Telecom or whatever. So they've got different skill sets. So they're basically different groups. What they've got in common is that they're human and they're greedy. And so that's why I think the lessons that we can learn from regular crime could really interestingly be analysed and to check how relevant they are in relation to cybercrime. So we know, for example, there are repeat victims in the regular world. People get repeatedly victimized. Is that the same in cybercrime? We know crime concentrates in the real world heavily in space and in time. Is it the same in cybercrime? There are loads of fascinating questions like that to ask. And my one final thought is that, and I picked this up from a conference I was at a few months ago, those cyber criminals, they want safe systems too, and you've described them as businesses. So what happens if someone does a DDoS attack on one of their businesses? You know, give us your Bitcoin or we'll take you down, whatever the phrase might be. I think, just to summarize, there's a huge amount of interesting read across from the real world into the cyber world, which we've barely touched on. And it comes back to breaking down those silos within universities, between the police and the governments and other countries and internationally and so on. So I've cheered up a bit.
Good to hear. Mikko, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to the comments, but I also wanted to just pick up on this issue of incentives, because you made a really interesting comment about how for someone with high level of skill in a place like the UK or Finland or the West generally, there are great jobs awaiting us, and that's not the case everywhere. And so there is this kind of incentive for people to exploit their skills in perhaps one of the only ways open to them. And then I noticed on that slide you had about the popcorn attack, that it said in little print at the bottom that we're raising money for the people of Syria who've been through a terrible war, and really sorry about this, but we need the money. And that's another kind of incentive. That's this kind of geopolitical, fundraising, which was really quite moving actually when you read it, and I did kind of think I would give a Bitcoin, to that actually. How do you see these kind of, these issues of incentive? And I just wanted to ask you to kind of fold that in also to your response.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I wanted to make a comment about how surprisingly well Ukraine has been able to defend itself in this war, both in the real world, but of course, we're here speaking about cyber. And you're right, it's been surprising how well they've fared. And then again, maybe it is not surprising. You see, Ukraine is the best country in Europe to defend its networks against Russian cyber aggression. I'm confident about this. They're better than anyone. They're better than Finland, better than Germany, better than France, better than UK. Why? Because they've been doing it in practice for 8 years. Like the rest of the Europe, we are playing war games or tabletop exercises against theoretical attacks, which might happen. They're actually doing it for real. When you do something for 8 years, you become an expert in it. And that's what they've done. And they've done it in the middle of really tough environment. Ukraine is a poor country. 44 million people, their GDP is 1/5 of Finland. They have run a lot of old legacy systems, which are hard to defend when you're running outdated operating systems. Yet, they are able to do it. And the explanation is in practical expertise. Then, an interesting point about the intelligence being gathered about this and how we should believe the intelligence when we see it. Both US and UK intelligence agencies saw this war coming a month or two ahead, and they unusually went public and said that, this is going to happen. It's going to happen roughly now, and roughly this is going to happen. And none of us believed it. I didn't believe it. And they had the right intelligence. They were willing to burn their sources to come out and tell the world. And we just didn't believe it. So now, when US intelligence is telling, again, that they have information which they believe that Russia is going to use cyber attack against the United States to retaliate the sanctions, I think we should believe them on that. They've just shown, both US and UK intelligence have shown that they have visibility and they were able to make the calls, and they're willing to make these calls publicly. And now they're making this call publicly, and we should pay attention. And then about the level of knowledge of street thugs and online criminals, which is a very interesting topic, but it's sometimes also surprising. When you were speaking about that, I immediately remember this one case I was working on a couple of years ago involving a piece of malware which we found, which was running an unending denial of service attack against a website in Estonia. The website belonged to an insurance company. Investigating the case, we found the malware author, an Estonian guy in his 50s, a bit older than what you typically would think would be a malware writer. His profession, taxi driver. Why was he launching a denial of service attack against a local insurance company because he had crashed his Mercedes and the insurance company wouldn't pay. So to retaliate, he wrote a piece of malware 100% in assembly language, like Windows malware which contained the networking code and everything in assembly, and then unleashed it. And it was a headless bot, which means there's no central command, which means there's no way to stop it, even if the guy was caught and sentenced and actually went to jail and got out of jail, and the malware is still going there. And his motive was to revenge. He crashed his car, he didn't get paid, so he wrote a piece of malware. These kind of guys are hard to predict beforehand or explain, but they do exist. It's a big world, and we see complex attacks. And I guess that's also one way, one incentive someone could have to write a piece of malware. Maybe rare, but they do exist. And absolutely there are other kinds of incentives besides just money. Money for yourself. You might be collecting money for donations. Or you just want to get your message out. We see tons of attacks right now from groups like Anonymous, which are not about money at all. It's all about something else. It's about getting heard or making your voice heard. People are willing to break the law to protest or to follow a political motive, and that's a totally different incentive. But by far, the most common type of cyber attack we see, the most likely thing any of us would get hit by, is money-motivated cybercrime. We estimate that 98% of the malware samples we analyze in our labs is about making money. Sure, other kinds of attacks exist, including extremists and terrorists. They exist as well, or anonymous or hacktivists, or governmental attacks. Governmental attacks are really bad when they happen, but they are really rare. Most of us are never going to be targeted by a foreign intelligence agency. It's just unlikely to happen because these attacks are very targeted. So the vast majority of these attacks are about money. And the best way for us to fight that is to show the potential people who are about to enter the life of cybercrime that cybercrime doesn't pay. And the best way to show that is to catch online criminals and put them into jail. That's what we should be doing more. And we were on our way. It looked so good a year ago, and now it looks worse.
Craig, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just think take Laura's point as well. Looking at how do you reduce? You raise the risk effectively, you raise the effort, but actually it's gone the other way around in cyber, because tools that only used to be available to states to be able to use, now you can buy off the shelf for $10. You can deploy those things very, very easy. So your level of knowledge to launch an attack as well doesn't necessarily need to be there. You can set that business model up where you can, outsource a lot of your work, which is what we see. You see the Conti Group, you see other groups there as well, where they do outsource their work effectively. And again, the trust element in that as well. The example you gave in Ukraine, what we've seen in the last 6 weeks, we haven't seen in the last 6-10 years effectively in terms of information where we can see where the criminals have turned on themselves, doxed each other effectively, and share that information out. But my next point is, so what? What are we going to do with that information? How are we going to actually turn that information into, as Mikko said, about prosecutions, locking people up effectively? Where are we going to be able to do that? And again, that's one of the things we're trying to do, whereby we go back to local communities where the criminals are based, and we do our prosecutions there. So we take the evidence from the US or the UK, and we identify the crime actors in Nigeria. Now, we can do that because we've got the funding, we've got the buy-in. But actually, and I'm going to call them hard-to-reach jurisdictions, how do we work in that space? So November, December, I spent a week in Moscow, and that's exactly the conversations I was having there as the Director of Cybercrime at Interpol, Craig Jones, or in New Zealand, on the National Crime Agency. I can have those conversations. And again, that's where we were starting to develop that. And we'd actually done some joint work between the US and Russia as well about a carding forum. Now, that was quite a simple piece of work, realistically, from a law enforcement point of view, taking out those countries, if you like, but bringing those countries into it. It brought a whole different dimension into it. And as I said, we only deal with crime. So I don't need to have those conversations at that state level about what the states are doing to each other. So come back to that lowest common denominator, come back to reducing the global impact of cybercrime and protecting communities for a safer world, which is our strategy and our programme. But now we've had this major conflict that's now going on, that's really changed quite a lot of what we'd hoped to do at Interpol, what other countries had hoped to do as well. But also it's going to give us opportunities as well.
I can't remember if it was you, Craig, earlier, or Mikko just recently who made this point about the relationship between reporting crime, cybercrime, and the funding. It was you earlier, Craig. So in other words, if these crimes aren't reported, then the money doesn't flow in for the prevention and remediation activities. How does that kind of work in this international dimension where you're cooperating across such a huge geographic area?
So I think if I take it from the UK context, when they did the national security piece round about 2015-16, cyber was identified as a tier 1 risk to the UK. So straight away that brought money into the UK budget. And I can't remember at the moment, it's 4 billion. It's a huge amount invested in that period. And we all looked at that and how could we use that money. So that's one way investment comes in. WannaCry was another way we got investment. And we always say, don't, use a conflict, use, a crisis to actually then improve. So again, from a law enforcement point of view, we use that. Internationally, leaving the EU gave an opportunity. And you look at the UK strategy now about being a cyber power and the investment now that they're looking to put out internationally. I'm not saying it's coordinated enough at the moment, but they are looking to see, well, okay, where's the harm emanating from? Where do we need to go and support countries building capacity? How do we understand about that investment? And then what's the return on that investment as well? And that's why Interpol's now getting investment. That's why other countries are getting investment as well. And specifically about building capabilities in some countries. We use the opportunity side around Africa, for example. We know there's a lot of ongoing upskilling in Africa, but are the jobs there in Africa? No, they're not. So we're seeing a lot of those people that have been to university, got those qualifications now, the organised crime groups are bringing them in. And again, this is where you'll see that the real world crime and the online crime combining effectively. And again, coming back to that money motivated cybercrime, which I quite like. I'm going to borrow that one as well.
Gloria, what are your thoughts then, following on from that about, the UK doesn't include cybercrime statistics in crime statistics. So where are we with that, and what are the implications of that for what Craig's talking about?
The implications are profound. You can't solve a problem if you don't know what it is. And the problem is manifest by the data. And I ask any of you, if you were a victim of cybercrime and you wanted to report it, who would you report it to? The first thing you do is tell the bank. And the last person you've mentioned to is the police, I suspect. And as it happens, I think, am I still right in saying you've got to tell the City of London police that you've been
action fraud?
Action fraud. You tell action fraud. Got that, write it down. It's ridiculous. The only way we got any kind of a grip on the extent of cybercrime at an individual level in this country was through the crime survey for England and Wales, which asked a whole heap of people, have you been a victim of something? And in 2016, for the first time, they asked about cybercrime, and it doubled the crime rate. Oh my gosh, we didn't know. Wish we hadn't asked. Police data, it's non-existent in the police data. And the other thing we know from the yonks of research we spent with regular crime is you can't prevent burglary, but you can prevent burglary on that housing estate and those repeat victims. And you can't prevent robbery, but bank robbery was prevented yonks ago. So you've got to break down the crime into its specific type. A DDoS attack is different from a romance scam. If you want to prevent romance scams, which are horrid, and leave people devastated. You look at the number of romance companies that those connect you to somebody lovely websites, and you find that there's a significant number of those websites have far more crime than all the rest. something like 20% of the websites have 80% of the crime. And that's because they don't check on the people who are registering with them. It is not difficult, but you can't do anything without data.
Yeah.
And, we've talked about individuals, but companies, and you've been talking about companies being attacked, they often won't say when they've been a victim of cybercrime because it reflects on their bottom line. They keep their mouth shut like TalkTalk started to do when they were hit. So there's a whole pile of, we've got to start thinking very differently about, and data has to be the beginning.
Gordon, perhaps you could talk a little bit about, just following on from that, about how you see these levels, different layers of accountability in the context of cybercrime as linked to national security. How do we kind of think about where where responsibility lies for mitigating against this? Craig's talked a lot about, Mikko, how there's this reliance on the private sector for addressing this. But how can we think about that differently?
I think that's a good question, because I think one of the challenges for us in the media is when you have a company being hit, what is the balance between blaming the victim and blaming the criminal? And it's quite a difficult one, because you shouldn't be victim blaming. Fundamentally, the criminal is the one who's carried out the crime. Let's be clear about that. But then occasionally you read about just how badly secured some of these systems are. And you go, well, hang on a sec. Isn't it fair to be asking about why you didn't patch those systems? And then you can get into some quite interesting discussions. I mean, so on that, I remember WannaCry very well. And you remember it hit the NHS. It was a North Korean cyber attack, money making, which went out of control, hit the NHS. But what was interesting was only certain NHS trusts got hit. And of course, the ones who patched and upgraded and had the best cybersecurity didn't get hit at all. And those who hadn't, didn't get, hadn't upgraded, got hit worse. And so then you get the question, well, should you be pointing the finger at them? Maybe. But then when I remember talking to some of the people involved in that, and they were like, we are making critical decisions every week about where to put our resources, our finite resources in this health trust, which are pretty limited. And it's patient care there or cybersecurity there. How do we balance that out? That's quite tough. And you can see why people might struggle with always prioritizing cybersecurity. So then you get into questions of, well, is it about regulation? Is it about, how far the government mandates it? How far should that be the case, rather than leaving it up to, if you like, that individual, the poor, security manager of that NHS trust, to be the one responsible? So I think they're quite interesting, quite complicated questions about responsibility and accountability in defending against cybercrime, and where it becomes a national issue, where actually, the state should be dealing with this, but sometimes, the criminals are in another jurisdiction, as we heard, and then it becomes almost a national security diplomatic question, as well as bolstering defences. So I'm afraid the answer is complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, in a sense, so I want to come to you, Mikko, on that, because you've obviously seen the inside of so many organizations who have suffered a breach or some kind of attack, and I guess you've seen what they had in place and what your expectations might have been of what they had in place. What are your views on that?
It's a great example by Gordon. I mean, these healthcare systems did get the budgets to upgrade their legacy systems, to be able to patch them with the latest security patches, but they only got them after WannaCry. Like we required a pretty drastic and almost tragic wake-up call before we actually did anything about it. And that's not the right way to do it. We really should be trying to prevent these things from happening, not just react when really bad things happen. We actually asked the statistics, the death statistics for United Kingdom for the WannaCry week to see if there's any change. There wasn't. There was roughly the same amount of deaths in this country during the WannaCry week. But I was wondering, I wouldn't have been surprised if there would have been something we could see. And that's another thing I wanted to mention about the very real cost of some of these attacks. There's been cases where human loss of life, has happened. Very rare cases, but documented cases where people have died because of cyber attacks. But there are other really expensive, costly things that happen to us you mentioned romance scams or romance scams of various kinds. That's a very good example. It's the kind of attack, cyber attack, which typically gets a chuckle out of people. Yeah, he fell for a romance scam. These are very tragic cases. I was working recently on a case where a young man, 25, was working for a law enforcement agency as a clerk, secretary, and fell for the first love of his life online. He had never dated anyone, then finally he found someone online, fell headfirst. Traditional scammers from faraway country were milking this poor guy, all the money he had. He started stealing from his parents, he started stealing money, taking loans in his parents' names. Eventually got caught. He's in jail now. So his love of his life wasn't real. And he was fired, and now he's in jail. So very real. I mean, it's surprising he's alive when you consider how bad it is. I'll give you another example. During the pandemic, in my home country of Finland, we had the biggest crime of our history. More victims in single crime than ever before. 36,250 victims in a hack of a private psychological therapy center, where the hacker stole the therapist notes of 36,000 people. The notes were people, including underage children, had discussed with their therapist, the kinds of things that you don't discuss with anyone else than your therapist. And then the scammer was blackmailing the victim, sending each victim an email to send me bitcoins or I will leak your therapist notes online. And in the end, he did. All of those notes are online today. There's a search engine online where you can find all of these things. Very real, very human cost for cybercrime, which has nothing to do with money, but other types of cost.
Yeah, I think there was a lot in that WannaCry incident to kind of unpack. And my understanding of that was that it wasn't just, saying the victim blaming. It wasn't just these IT guys working in hospitals who somehow hadn't thought to patch and upgrade, but that a lot of that equipment is not able to be upgraded. They can't, very, very expensive equipment that can't be upgraded. And as you said, these kind of questions of whether to hire more surgeons or nurses or to invest in cybersecurity. But there was also this other economic element to that, which was that I mean, Mikko, correct me if I'm wrong with this, but that those patches were available by subscription. But the NHS Trust had been advised that not to bother with that. And that at that time, I remember that Microsoft was making $7 billion a quarter in profit. $7 billion a quarter. And I thought, if the NHS Trust in the UK they cannot afford to replace this equipment or to upgrade their systems, then what on earth is happening in the developing world? And how come Microsoft just doesn't take a little bit of that money and ensure that those legacy systems are supported? So this kind of public-private relationship.
So I'm bursting to say, you need to change the system so that it isn't the NHS Trust's responsibility to get those patches, in my view. It's Microsoft's responsibility to give them to them. If they buy the system in the first place, it should come with a postscript that says, oh, and we'll keep it up to date, Mrs. And you won't have to pay anything. And that's a systems design. It's not just about, the whole business about crime prevention is about looking at systems and products and services and designing them differently to prevent these things from happening in the first place. And Microsoft's a great example of a great big fat company with more money than it knows what to do with. Well, people are struggling on the street. Sorry, carried away.
Let me spoil your day.
Okay, go on. Provocative.
Yes, we can blame Microsoft for all of these things, yet it's the best in the industry for doing this. They already provide patches and updates typically for 10 years. If you look at some of the operating systems, you get support for 10 years. No one else does that. They're already supporting it for really long times. And my point here isn't actually that. My point is everything is becoming a computer. Look at your cars. If you have a modern car, you're driving a computer. You're driving a data center on 4 wheels. I recently had a poll online for my followers on Twitter where I asked a simple question. How many years do you think your car manufacturer should provide your car with security patches? Like crucial security patches. There's computers, they need patching. How many years? And car is a great example because cars we operate for, I'm driving a 21-year-old car right now. The consensus of my followers was that they would like their car to get patches for 25 years, which is a realistic expectation. And it's not happening. And this is going to affect not just cars, but everything. Everything around us is going to become computers, and they have to be maintained and updated and patched forever. It's going to be a big problem.
Yeah, and basically we don't know when we buy a connected device now for how long it will be supported.
Or that it's connected at all.
Yeah, or that it's connected at all, absolutely. Great.
I was just going to say that comes back to that business model. What's your business model?
Yes.
Doing patches for 25 years is not going to bring in the revenue unless you launch a new product. So you launch a new product, you lose the focus on the other product effectively.
Yeah.
So again, you get that balance from a business perspective where they're there to make the profits at the end of the day.
So is it fair to say that the market case for cybersecurity has failed?
So I wouldn't necessarily say it's failed. I think still within boardrooms, cybersecurity is not treated as a normal business risk. It's not identified as a business risk. You have the level of boards where you have people, normally males, over the age of 50, who the technology, they've adopted it and they don't understand it, but they've been told they have to have it and they have to have it. It's all very, very complicated. Give us small money and we can do this, this and this. And then that's why you see when there's a major incident, the heads roll within the company effectively. But, the owners are still there at the end of the day and they just renew. I'll give you one example of a very well-known toy manufacturer globally that have electronic toys, mainly aimed at children. And I had a phone call from a solicitors agency, and one of these very strange conversations where I'm thinking, where's this going? They said, you're head of cybercrime unit, we'd like to discuss a case. I said, it's okay, who are you? Well, we act on solicitors, we're acting for refer. This isn't your normal policing referral, this isn't phoning a back and forth. So for half an hour we danced around it, but effectively what had happened is their systems had been breached, they lost the data, they called in a cyber incident response team who identified the person, single person in the UK, had taken all the data, he'd then encrypted it and then stored it effectively and gone back to them and said, your security systems aren't very, very good. What they were worried about was the reputational damage from that. And as happened, once it was reported in the press, there was then a class action against that company. So their profits were then hit effectively. And that came down to some very, very simple security. Don't have admin as your password.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line to it. So again, if you're dealing at that level, right through to companies that have got very, very good cybersecurity, people talk about you're only as weak as your weakest link, but that's not really the case. That's your strong point. You're as strong as your strongest point effectively, and that's what you should aim at.
Mikko, what are your thoughts then about, anyone actually, about the role of regulation or legislation to deal with these issues? If boards are not well enough equipped or not taking these issues seriously enough, if companies are not, no company is impervious, I guess, but there are degrees of responsibility in terms of protecting data and protecting systems. Is there a role for regulation to, I guess, stimulate that attention and effort a little more?
Well, at least we do have global, we don't have global laws, we'll never have global laws, but we have local laws everywhere now for cybercrime. And I still remember the time when that wasn't the case. We used to have like black spots on the map and criminals could reroute their crime through those countries because it wasn't illegal there. That's no longer the case. Cybercrime is handled everywhere like real world crime, like it should, and that's great. Now, legislation only gets us so far, right? Crime is already illegal. People will still be doing crime. That's not going to end it, unfortunately. I'm not a big fan of regulation, unfortunately. most of the regulation that I see, I think, fails. Even the good, seemingly well-intended piece of regulation, I'll give you cookie law. Cookie law makes perfect sense. Let's tell the consumers that this site uses technology to track you. What's the end result? Every website you go to pops up a box and you click OK. Like nobody reads none of that. You click click OK to make the box go away. It doesn't really help anything at all. Now, could I see places where regulation would actually make a difference? Well, IoT comes to mind. Now, when you buy appliances to your home, washing machine, toaster, you assume that it's not going to catch fire. You assume it's not going to give you electric shock. And you can assume that because we've certified and regulated this internationally for decades. And that actually works. And if it does happen, if your washing machine catches fire and your house burns down, the vendor is responsible for the damage. Now, if the same washing machine is online and it's used to gain access to your internal network and every laptop in your home is ransom Trojan because of that washing machine, nobody's responsible. And this we could change through regulation, and maybe we should. At the same time, that would mean making software vendors responsible for the damage caused by their software, which makes me really split on this because I'm getting paid by a software company. And the last thing I'd want is for us to be responsible for bugs in our code because there's always bugs in the code. At the same time, as a privacy expert, that's exactly what we should be doing. And there is talk about that, exactly about regulating the security of IoT devices, or even better, regulating that the vendors be responsible for the damages caused by insecurity of their IoT devices.
That would be a huge shift.
Yes, it should.
A huge shift.
Indeed.
Yeah. But that's what we're here for today, right? It's to be provocative and to think about, outside of the kind of cozy parameters of the way we normally think about these things. And perhaps that would be a good way to wrap up the panel with, if I could ask each of you and Gloria, I'm going to start with you and walk back down the line because I think you have an answer to this already. What in your in your wildest dreams, what is it that needs to change? And not thinking realistically or what's achievable or what's likely, but just completely out of the box, completely blue sky. What needs to change to address cybercrime, to address global cybercrime in a more effective way?
in a word.
In a word?
Well, I've got two words: effective partnerships, by which I mean everyone agreeing on what the outcome needs to be. And when I say everyone, I mean Russia and everyone in between, internationally. We don't want cybercrime. And you can't hide anywhere. So, it's not going to happen. But
yeah,
at that level, people have got to, civil society has got to deal with it and take responsibility for it, and that includes counting it.
Or put upward pressure, at least, perhaps.
Well, understand that they're not going to catch every cyber criminal, and some of them are going to kill people. They're not going to catch them. They've got to concentrate, at least start with prevention. Detection is what you do when everything else has failed. And right now, there's a lot of mileage in prevention, and then disruption, and then detection. But let's start with prevention, and there's a huge amount that could be done there.
Thanks, Gloria. Craig?
Well, I think, we're talking about this in a global context, but the impact I'll keep coming back to is locally. We've talked about a couple of cases there, and we have seen people who have taken their own lives who have been victims of this crime. So it does, for me, come back to the protection, prevention. How can we use technology effectively, which supports us in all of our day-to-day activities, is extremely useful. We can't do without it. I'll be looking at the tube thing in a minute, all that side of it. But actually accepting that we have to have that security by design, by default, built into those systems, and then maintained going forward. And we have to accept that. We have to accept that sometimes we won't be able to get onto something quite as quickly as we hope to, or we won't be able to access that bank account from that device. And it's taking that responsibility that you do in the physical space and applying that in the online space.
Yeah, thank you. Mikko?
I used the pandemic to write a book about this very topic. The book comes out in August, and it basically says that we must not lose hope. Things easily look grim when you look at what's happening in the space of these cyber criminals and the attacks we see and how they've been getting worse. But we have to remember that this digital revolution, the internet revolution, has brought us much, much more good than bad. It is changing the way we see risk. It's changing the crime that affects us. But there's so much bigger upsides than downsides. And when cybercrime happens, when data leak happens, or ransomware happens, or whatever, we only see the failures. When there's a headline about cybercrime in tomorrow's paper, it's about some company getting hacked. There's never a headline saying that the second largest company in our country did not get hacked yesterday. That's not news. And we see these successes over and over again. Like the IT department heroically stays overnight to patch a system to prevent an attack, which would have happened in the morning, but didn't because they patched it in time. That's not news. And I've sometimes used the term cybersecurity Tetris to describe this, because in Tetris, you're trying to make a whole line, and when you succeed, the line disappears. Your successes disappear, your failures pile up. That's what we're seeing.
Yeah. Gordon?
It's nice to hear an optimistic view, because I normally tend towards the pessimistic. You wanted radical thoughts. I mean, I always think one of the problems is the internet is inherently insecure. It was built by academics to share, not with security in mind, and it's quite hard to retrofit security on some aspects of it. So the one radical idea would be, and I remember people 10, 20 years talking about, should we keep that internet over there and build a new internet over here, which is actually has got kind of security and verification and and is more secure. It doesn't seem very realistic now, because the longer that goes on, you built so much on top of it, you can't really create another one. So that would be radical. And then echoing what we heard earlier, peace in our time would help, I guess, because as long as there's kind of safe havens where criminals can operate, tensions between states, then people are going to offer places out of which criminals can continue their work and will sometimes be utilized by states. So unfortunately, peace in our time is the other radical, optimistic thought to try and deal with the problem.
Yeah, I'm sure we will share that one. I think I would just finish on an optimistic note to bring us up to speed for where we need to be for the reception to properly enjoy that. And say that one of the things that I see as a really positive development in higher education is this much more fluidity and agility in the way we teach and we research. So we no longer feel kind of trapped within these disciplines. It's much easier for us to work together with computer scientists, with economists, with lawyers, with psychologists, and what I think I see is that when we bring those people together, that we really can work on problems, on complex problems, and it's a very exciting way to work. I think universities are well placed to do that, and I think that is making a difference, because we're developing different people. We're developing people that are comfortable working across those boundaries and comfortable working outside of their comfort zones, and I think that is my optimistic note, and what I believe will make a difference. On that, I would just like to join with all of you in really thanking what an incredible panel and keynote speaker for today. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to have every one of you join us. So thank you so much.
So I would like to thank all Mikko, all our panelists again. So this has been is part of a series of the Peter Kirstein lecture series. As a department, we plan to organize for sure annually this series of events. And we would like to have more events that are like outreach events, like the one that we attending today. And for us, I would just want to stress one thing that Mikko said, that was about the importance also of going in depth. And for us, like as a computer scientist, it's also important to interact with the external world and then going back and going in depth. And probably this is our contribution in this space. So I want also to give some gifts to our speakers and our panelists. So this is like you can. I want to give you. So we have inside a USB key with a malware for everyone. That's always standard. It is done by our students, so you can keep it. So thanks a lot. And I would like just another round of applause for everyone, and the event continues in the quad. Thanks a lot.